The Life and Legacy of Rolando Calando Olalla, a tribute to a labor leader and his fight for justice. In the Philippines, labor leaders have faced threats, violence, and even death. One of them was Rolando Calando Olalla, a man who dedicated his life to the labor movement but was brutally silenced. In the fight for workers' rights, some heroes do not live to see the change they fought for. One of them was Rolando Calando Olalla, a labor leader whose dedication to justice and equality cost him his life. Today, we take a closer look at his legacy, his tragic assassination, and what it means for labor rights in the Philippines today. Rolando Olalla was born into activism. His father, Felixberto Olalla, was a well-known labor leader, and Calando followed in his footsteps. Rolando Olalla was more than just a labor leader. He was a champion of workers' rights. As chairman of Kilusang Mayo Uno, KMU, and president of National Federation of Labor Unions, he led thousands of workers in the fight for fair wages, better working conditions, and job security. He believed that workers should not just be employees, but should have a say in shaping the policies that affect their lives. His leadership was a beacon of hope for laborers across the country, but in the eyes of those in power, he was a threat. After the fall of Marcos' dictatorship, he pushed for genuine democratic reforms, but his activism made him a target. The assassination of Rolando Olalla. On November 12, 1986, Rolando Olalla and his driver Leonor Alay were abducted. The next day, their bodies were found in Antipolo, Rizal, tortured, beaten, and shot multiple times. Olalla had 4 gunshot wounds to the head and 2 to the body, and with 4 stab wounds. His hands were bound and newspaper were stuffed into his mouth. His face was mutilated beyond recognition. He was identified only by a scar on his right leg. The body of Alay was found about a kilometer away, both bodies bearing signs of brutal torture. His murder was widely believed to be politically motivated. At the time, the Philippines was transitioning from dictatorship to democracy, and the military was divided. A faction known as the the Armed Forces Movement or RAM was linked to the crime, but despite strong suspicions, justice remained out of reach for decades. Investigations pointed to members of the Armed Forces Movement RAM, a military faction involved in coup attempts against President Corazon Aquino. But justice was slow. It took decades before suspects were convicted. Even today, questions remain. Despite this, Calando's assassinations became a turning point, fueling stronger activism, inspiring a new generation of labor leaders. The labor movement mourned. Protesters flooded the streets demanding justice for Calando, but for years, the case remained unresolved. It wasn't until 2016, 30 years later, that members of RAM were finally convicted. But by then, many of the masterminds had escaped punishment. The long delay proved one thing. In the Philippines, justice for labor leaders is often slow and incomplete. Despite his tragic death, Rolando Olalla's fight did not end. His legacy lives on in the labor movement, in every strike, every protest, and every worker demanding fair treatment. But the dangers faced by labor's activists remain. Even today, union leaders continue to face threats, harassment, and violence. Rolando Olalla's story is a reminder that workers' rights must always be defended. If we forget the sacrifices of leaders like him, we risk losing the freedoms they fought so hard for. Rolando Calando Olalia gave his life for the Filipino workers. His story is not just a history lesson, it's a call to action. The struggle for workers' rights is far from over, and it's up to us to continue the fight. Let us remember his sacrifice honors his legacy and stand up for justice, because a nation that forgets its labor heroes is doomed to repeat its past.